Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you for coming to day 2 of Housing Stability Services Program training, contract implementation for your ERA2 contracts. See, we've got a lot of folks kind of coming on. I see some repeat folks from yesterday, so thank you for coming back after the more dry topic of contract elements. Today we're going to get into some exciting stuff about client eligibility and allowable expenses under this grant. I'll go through a couple of housekeeping reminders and then we'll get into the day's training. As I mentioned yesterday, I am Kate Trace. I'm the director of the Housing Stability Services Program at TDHCA. Today's presenter is Frank Sarno. He'll take over in just a moment. And then we've also got the rest of our staff on the line, so they'll be available for questions. I think myself and Alex Postelnik will be answering questions towards the end. If we could go to the next slide, please. So again, just a quick group of housekeeping reminders. All of these materials are going to be available on our webpage. The slides for today have already been posted. All of the handouts are available either in the group of materials for today's training or throughout the webpage grouped where they're supposed to go with forms. All of the handouts are also available in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar panel. Also in that panel is the questions box. So please send us questions that you have. If we don't get to them during the webinar, we will follow up directly with you. Your contact information when you enter your question will be tagged with it, so we'll get back directly. This training will be recorded. It will be posted on the webpage. It takes about a day or so for our IS staff to get the video formatted and posted online, but this will be available and posted as soon as possible. A communication will go out probably on Friday as a reminder that all of the materials are available and pointing you to any new materials that we've presented as handouts or have pointed you to in the webinar. So there'll be a wrap up on Friday as well. I think that's all of the basic housekeeping reminders I'm supposed to say. Just ask us questions. We're here to help you learn how to successfully administer this program. And I'm really excited to see so many folks back again today for participation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Frank. Can we go to the next slide, please? And Frank will lead you through the agenda and eligible activities and program expenses.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So as Kate said, my name is Frank Sarno. I'm a program administrator on the HSS program. Welcome to day 2 of our training. We're going to talk about client eligibility and allowable program and administrative expenses today. We're going to discuss household eligibility for the ERA2 HSS program, including income determination, client intake, and other considerations. And then we're going to discuss some specific examples of programmatic expenses, including eligible and ineligible expenses and administrative expenses. Like Kate said, at the end we'll have time for questions. Please feel free to type questions in the question box, and we will try to answer them in real time. Next slide, please. Okay. So household eligibility requirements. In order for a household to be eligible for this program, there are certain criteria that household has to meet. The first is financial hardship. One or more individuals within the household has to have qualified for unemployment benefits or experienced a reduction in household income, incurred significant costs, or experienced other financial hardship due to or during the COVID-19 pandemic. As our ERA1 subrecipients will note, this is a slightly broader eligibility criteria than ERA1 because the financial hardship qualifies if it simply happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Second is housing instability. In order for a household to be eligible, one or more individuals within the household must demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability. Third is income eligibility. The household has to have an income at or below 80% of the area median income, including all members of the household over the age of 18. And we do provide a resource to calculate your AMI and our program guidelines if your organization needs that. Next is income verification. A household must verify their monthly or yearly income using IRS tax documentation, eligibility for another federal program such as SNAP or WIC, or through a self-attestation of income. I believe most ERA1 subrecipients elected to verify income through the self-attestation method, but we'll discuss the different options later. And lastly on this page, no duplication of benefits. So households cannot receive the same benefits from multiple ERA2 subrecipients. So for example, multiple subrecipients cannot provide landlord incentives for the same household, but subrecipients may provide non-overlapping benefits for the same household. So if one subrecipient provides transportation to view an apartment, another subrecipient can provide a landlord incentive for my client to then move into that apartment. Next slide, please. Okay, as we discussed on the previous slide, I just wanted to put this language up here for you all to see. In order to qualify for the ERA2 program, one or more individuals has to qualify for unemployment benefits or experience a reduction in household income, incurred significant costs, or experience other financial hardship due to or during COVID-19 pandemic, and has to demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability, and has to meet the income threshold at or below 80% of the area median income. A question we got yesterday, US citizenship is not required for a household to be eligible for ERA2 services. Next slide. Okay, this slide has a lot of text on it. We wanted this to be a resource for you all, so you can look at this presentation on our website and reference it as you're working on your intake and your processes. Per updated Treasury guidance, self-attestation of household income without further verification as to household income is sufficient for determining income eligibility for housing stability services under ERA2. Self-attestation from a household must be certified by a caseworker, a housing navigator, or other housing stability service professional at your organization. And the subrecipient must reassess the household's income every 3 months. In practice, organizations receiving ERA1 funds have re-verified the household income with the client and signed and dated the original form to update it, which included the client's original self-attestation. In appropriate cases, subrecipients may rely on an attestation directly from a housing stability service professional with knowledge of a household's circumstances to certify that an applicant's household income qualifies for assistance. As an organization, you may always ask households to provide income documentation upon request. You're not required to accept self-attestation if you have reason to believe it's inaccurate. 2 notes on self-attestation. Income attestations should specify the monthly or annual income claimed by the household to ensure that the household meets the applicable ERA requirements and to enable appropriate reporting. And income for all household members 18 years of age or older must be considered when attesting to annual household income. All members included in the lease, if that's applicable, should be included in income determination unless the tenant indicates in the application that one or more persons in the lease no longer resides in the unit. Finally, income documentation is very important. The subrecipient must retain documentation on the certified self-attestation, including staff verification and those 3-month updated verifications. And no documentation of self-attestation requires a notarization, whether that's from the household, or caseworker, housing navigator, or other housing stability service professional. We don't have a specific form for self-attestation, but we do have a template on our client intake, which is available for subrecipients to use and reference as needed. Next slide, please. Again, we included this slide as a reference for you to be able to go back and view on our website. So this is a flow chart which details eligibility and certification process. If a household has a barrier to providing documentation, the recommended method of eligibility determination is self-attestation, which requires, again, a household professional or staffer at your organization to sign the attestation to certify the household as eligible. As I mentioned before, this method requires an updated signature every 3 months to confirm the household is still eligible and the organization does not have reason to believe the household is no longer eligible. Treasury guidance strongly encourages grantees to avoid establishing documentation requirements that are likely to be barriers to participation for eligible households, including those with irregular incomes, such as those operating small business or gig workers, whose income is reported on the IRS 1099 form. However, grantees must require all applications for assistance to include an attestation from the applicant that all information included is complete and correct. Additionally, applicants can use either their most recent total annual income or their most recent 30 days of income. Income provided for the 30 days is annualized based upon the frequency of pay, hourly, weekly, biweekly, or monthly for those 30 days. If using the most recent 30 days of income, any reapplication for assistance later in the subrecipient's contract period must include a resubmission of income documentation. Some households receiving certain types of federal benefits are automatically or categorically income eligible. So that's another method you can use to ensure that your clients are eligible for the ERA2 HSS program. Next slide. Client intake. We have a sample client intake form available on our website, and it's linked here for you all to review. It's also included in our handouts if you wanted to pull that up and take a look at it. The sample client intake form is available as a template for you to change to your organization's needs. Organizations are not required to use this intake form, but it is recommended you review it to make sure that all required information for the HSS program is being properly collected. The client intake should include all eligibility criteria, which we're discussing today, and reporting requirements, which will be discussed in the reporting training by Alex tomorrow. Next slide, please. We discussed duplication of benefits a little bit yesterday. I just wanted to go over it again to reiterate. In order to ensure that housing stability services are not being duplicated across multiple agencies, we're requiring that each household attest that they're not receiving duplicated housing stability funds or services specifically from a TDHCA program, from this TDHCA program. You'll see on our client intake sample form, it's just a checkbox that's then followed by a signature by the applicant or client. So the certification can be a standalone certification. It's usually part of the intake or screening form. Just please be sure to keep accurate records of this certification in your client files. Duplication of benefits includes households working with the Texas Homeless Network, THN, on emergency housing voucher administration, and for organizations funded for legal aid outside of the Texas Access to Justice Foundation or TAJF program. Please ensure households do not receive duplication of benefits from multiple organizations for the same services under ERA2. This does not include households receiving rental assistance or utility assistance through TRR or other local rental assistance programs. It's only for ERA2 HSS subrecipients. Next slide, please. Length of assistance. The length of assistance is capped under the ERA2 Treasury guidance. Under Treasury guidance, households may receive housing stability assistance for up to 15 months with ERA2. And the aggregate amount of assistance an eligible household may receive under ERA2 combined with assistance under ERA1 must not exceed 18 months. So for those organizations that received ERA1 funds, keep that in mind. It is capped at 18 months total aggregate for ERA1 and ERA2. Next slide. Okay, we're going to pause here before we get into eligible program expenses and take a few questions from the question box if we have any. We'll have time for question and answer at the end, so if we don't get to your question now, we will get to it later or follow up with you after this training. Okay. Kate and Alex, do you guys want to take over for a minute?
Yeah, there are just a few questions that came in. We can address them to everyone right now. The first question was around income eligibility, whether it was AMI or CMI. It is area median income as defined by HUD. There's a link to the criteria and the limits on our webpage, and then we can also share that in the questions as well. The next question was, is there a different set of eligibility requirements for disabled individuals, physical or cognitive? The eligibility requirements are set, and they're set pretty broadly by Treasury, so there is no separate set of eligibility requirements based on disability status. I would say, as a caveat to that, there are reasonable accommodation requests that can be submitted to alleviate any barriers to meeting the eligibility requirements set forth by Treasury. And if you have specific questions, please reach out directly to us about potential accessibility options. Alex, feel free to jump in here. I see we've got some questions coming in. I'll do the next one on SNAP. If a client says that they have no income but has SNAP, would that qualify? Yeah, SNAP is listed in the group of categorical eligibility programs. So if someone has qualified for that program, you would document at intake that they have qualified for the SNAP program, therefore making them eligible, income eligible for this program. Okay. That's a good question. Do we anticipate releasing more ERA2 rental assistance funds during 2022? This question is not really applicable to this training, but I'll just take it right now in case anyone else might have this question in the back of their head. We don't know. It depends, but it's kind of out of our hands from the housing stability side. Any funds that would come back to rent, specifically rent relief, to the state under ERA would go through the Texas Rent Relief Program. It would not be funneled through this program. And right now, rent and utility payments are not allowable under this program. Alex, you want to jump in? We'll do maybe one or two more and then hand it back to Frank.
I keep muting myself here.
Okay.
There's just a few questions. So related to categorical eligibility based on participation in a federal program, so specifically SNAP, there does need to be documented proof of participation in that program. Usually an award or a benefits letter is the way to prove participation in that program. Additionally, actual proof of received benefits through, like a mailed check from a federal agency or something like that would also be sufficient. The guidance from Treasury at this time is to try to prevent any barriers possible from a person accessing services. So obviously, you want to collect that documentation, but you're going to want to make sure it has the person's name on it, and that it is like addressed to them. But you do not have to be overly stringent. Like there's not a particular form of documentation that Treasury has requested for federal programs. So, you know, it's really a case of best judgment, right? And tolerance for risk there.
Yeah, if an auditor would come to your organization and say, show me how you verified, use that as your line there. You know, if you can prove to them that that client received, you know, whether it was an award letter or, you know, some type of documentation from that program, that would be acceptable. I think maybe we could just pause right here. There's two more questions I'm just going to address real quickly, and then we can go back to Frank. Someone asked, can we get a copy of the slides? Yes, they're in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. They're also posted on the web page at the very top. So the slides are available. And then can we get a complete list of the categorical eligibility? That is one of the attachments in your contract. So yesterday we went through the contract and we talked about, you know, one of the last attachments to the contract being all of the eligibility requirements. So it's there. That that list is also posted online from the slides from yesterday as a handout. So I think we'll pause right here on questions and hand it back to Frank.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks, guys, for doing that. So next, we're going to talk about programmatic expenses, what's allowable, what's not allowable, and then get into some specifics. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this slide includes examples of allowable program costs and similar but not allowable costs. This isn't an exhaustive list. These are examples of what's allowable and what's not allowable that have come out frequently in our ERA1 program and also in refining our ERA2 budgets. We recommend you review our program guidelines for more details, and if you ever have a question, if something's eligible or not, please email us to make sure. The first one is healthcare. Therapy and mental health services are allowable program costs. However, prescriptions, medical equipment, and medical expenses are not allowable ERA2 program costs. The HSS program is meant to be a housing stability program and not a health provision program. However, therapy, counseling, mental health services are allowable as they apply to clients obtaining or maintaining stable housing. So for example, a program cannot hire a nurse with HSS funds to just be on staff, but billable hours may be an allowable expense if it's for eligible activities within this guidance. Second is transportation. Transportation for clients or staff to provide services, including cab fare, gas reimbursement, Uber, Lyft, or bus fare are allowable. Vehicle purchase, vehicle repair, and non-service related travel expenses are not allowable. Transportation expenses are allowable if they apply to serving a client. So for example, taking a client to see an apartment, providing transportation for housing navigators to visit a client, or providing transportation for a client to a job interview would all be allowable transportation expenses. And one note on this, gas is reimbursable at the IRS 2022 rate. Third, we have staff. So client-facing program staff, caseworkers, and housing navigators are allowable program costs. Any admin staff, any program managers that do not have client interaction, kitchen staff, janitorial staff, those are all not allowable program costs. They may be allowable administrative costs if they apply to the ERA2 HSS program. Staff must be client-facing in order to be eligible as a program expense, and there are no exceptions to this. So for example, intake staff, counselors, and housing navigators would all apply and be eligible as program expenses. Staff in management positions, such as a lead housing navigator, who also is client-facing, would be an allowable program expense because they work directly with clients. Fourth is technology. Purchase of a computer or broadband assistance to help a program participant attend an HSS training program, to search for employment, or to communicate with a remote medical provider is an allowable cost. The purchase of computers, broadband internet, or phone service for general program use is not an allowable program cost. Those may be allowable administrative costs, again, if they apply to the ERA2 HSS program. No individual purchase of equipment of $5,000 or more is allowed. And a question we've received from multiple subrecipients, just to clarify, computer purchases for staff, even if it is specifically for staff hired for the ERA2 HSS program, would be administrative expenses. Fifth is deposits and fees. Rental deposits, pet deposits, utility deposits, landlord incentives, and utility reconnection fees are allowable costs. As Kate said earlier, general rental assistance or utility assistance are not allowable program costs. We'll get into the details on deposits and fees later in this presentation, but wanted to put it here as well. We had a question yesterday, are utility arrears an allowable expense under the ERA2 program? They are not. Rental arrears and utility arrears are not allowable under the ERA2 HSS program. And additionally, ERA2 funds cannot be expended out of state. So for example, it's not allowable for a rental deposit to be paid in another state for a client. Six, we have outreach. Shelter outreach and landlord outreach are allowable so long as these activities directly serve eligible households. General marketing for your organization, outreach, public affairs expenses that don't directly serve eligible households are not allowable, though they may be allowable as administrative expenses. Subrecipients should always ask, does this activity directly help a household obtain or maintain housing? If the answer is no, then it's not an allowable program expense. And if you ever have a question, you should contact TDHCA staff with any concerns or questions regarding what's allowable and what's not. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about a subcategory of program expenses. Under the ERA2 program, we'd find direct household payments as rental, utility, or pet deposits, short-term payments for hotels or motels, and landlord incentives. While other approved activities may seem like they're direct household payments, this category of reporting is narrowly defined in our ERA2 program. Alex will talk more about reporting and direct household payments tomorrow. But in regards to their allowability as program expenses, I wanted to talk about it a little bit today. Deposits must not exceed 1 month's rent unless your organization submits a written request, including proof that it is customary in the local rental market to provide a deposit greater than 1 month's rent for TDHCA staff approval. This may include the use of double rental deposits utilized by your organization, by similar organizations, or widely in your rental market. After review, TDHCA staff will either approve or deny your request to provide double rent deposits and keep your documentation materials on file in accordance with Treasury requirements. Utility reconnection fees are an eligible expense provided that they are paid to a utility provider for an eligible renter household. Pet deposits are an eligible expense. They should not exceed $500 per pet or $1,000 for all pets. And last, ERA2 funds cannot match ESG funds, but may be used to match as a match for home or AmeriCorps funds if spent on eligible matching items for those programs. Subrecipients are allowed to pair ERA2 assistance with local rent relief programs as long as there's not a duplication of benefits. So for example, ERA1 subrecipients would often pair services with Texas rent relief clients. Next slide, please. Direct household payments and landlord incentives. So the last part of direct household payments is landlord incentives. In order for your organization to provide landlord incentives, you must submit a landlord incentive policy to TDHCA staff for our review and approval. If you would like to provide direct household payments as an eligible activity, you'll need to receive approval and update your budget and benchmarks before contract approval. Subrecipients are required to document incentive payments and/or security deposit in the lease agreement. Landlord incentives must not exceed 1 month's rent. You must keep the lease agreement in your client's files, and the lease must be at least 6 months in length. Next slide, please. Gift cards are an area we've had a lot of questions, so I wanted to go into a little more detail. So continuing our discussion on program expenses, gift cards are an eligible expense so long as they are used to purchase food, basic clothing, and hygiene items for eligible households. The subrecipient is required to keep receipts for all purchases. If the subrecipients are providing gift cards for restaurants or stores that only provide eligible items, such as a food co-op, fast food restaurant, or clothing resale store, they may be exempt from retaining receipts, provided that they note in their gift card policy how and why they vetted the establishment to ensure no ineligible items can be purchased. For instance, gift cards to restaurants that serve alcohol would not be eligible under general gift card policy. Box stores or grocery stores such as H-E-B require receipts to be tracked because you can purchase ineligible items at those stores. And your organization must document gift card use in the client's file so that can be retained for compliance requests at a future date. Last, a few notes. Your organization, again, must have a written policy and controls regarding gift card use that is compliant with 2 CFR Part 200. Gift card fees would count as administrative expenses, so the fees for purchasing a gift card would not be able to be logged as a program expense. Those would be administrative expenses. And units of government are not allowed to purchase and distribute gift cards for clients, only nonprofits. Next slide, please. We discussed technology costs on slide 13. I want to reiterate that broadband assistance, phone minutes, or the purchase of a computer or phone is allowed only if it is necessary to obtain or maintain housing. This includes helping a client attend an HSS training program, search for employment, or communicate with a remote medical provider. The link between technology purchase and housing must be clear for future compliance inquiries from TDHCA or Treasury. All technology purchases that are not directly for clients within the HSS program, including purchases for program staff, are administrative expenses, and no individual purchase of $5,000 or more is allowed, and purchases must be reasonable given the services provided and the client's needs. Next slide, please. This is a question we often get. Are childcare expenses an eligible program expense? Childcare expenses are eligible if your client is otherwise eligible for the ERA2 HSS program and they're searching for a new job so they can maintain or obtain stable housing. Childcare expenses may extend 2 months beyond the start of the new job to ensure stability within the new position. Next slide, please. Okay, our final section is going to be administrative expenses, and we can go to the next slide. Funds requested for administration are limited up to 10% of the total amount of funds requested. I'm sure you all are working through this as you submit and revise your program budgets. I want to go over a few of the details. Subrecipients can incur the following administrative costs to deliver the housing stability services under the ERA2 HSS program. Salaries and related costs. So all staff who are not client-facing but are a part of the ERA2 program, ERA2 HSS program, are categorized as an administrative expense, and that would be allowable. Supplies and overhead, such as utilities, maintenance, and other things. Supplies, even for program personnel, need to be recorded as administrative expenses. This includes office supplies and other items. Even if the supplies are for ERA2 HSS program specifically, they do not qualify as a program expense unless they're for a client. Next, we have equipment. Equipment purchases for staff, not specifically for clients, will always be an administrative expense. And last is transportation, mileage, and mileage for administrative functions, which we talked about earlier. Any transportation cost that is not for a client or for a staff member to assist a client is going to be categorized as an administrative expense. All expenses related to the organization implementing the ERA2 HSS program but that do not directly impact clients are categorized as administrative expenses. So that's the question you should ask yourself when you're determining whether or not it would be a program expense or an administrative expense. Okay, next slide. We can get into some questions. And I can turn it over to Kate and Alex to check the question box.
Okay, just switching gears here. Alex, how about you start this time? I see you've got a lot of direct answered questions in the questions box.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is if you want to see like written responses to a lot of the questions, then you can see it in the chat in the questions box. And I've written out a good amount of answers to questions we've received, but we can go through and kind of look at a few of these and go over them together, starting from the top. There's a question about mileage reimbursement. So as we all know, through the program guidelines, transportation costs are an eligible expense under this grant. Usually what that looks like is a rideshare service, a bus ticket, train ticket, for instance, so that a client can visit a unit or meet with a case manager or something like that, something to receive housing stability services. However, usually mileage reimbursement is not an eligible expense for clients. So mainly because there's no direct way to track or easy way to track where a client has been and how they are asking to be reimbursed for that mileage, right? Also with mileage reimbursement though, it is reimbursable for program staff in very specific instances that I believe is outlined in our program guidance. So it can either be, and it's at the IRS rate, we use the IRS rate for mileage reimbursement. It's either program or admin. So it's a program reimbursement if that mileage is used or reimbursed specifically so a case manager or housing navigator can go show a client a unit or go meet with a client to address some sort of housing stability concern. It is a admin expense if that case manager or housing navigator is not directly meeting with a client. So if they're going to go meet with a landlord, that's an admin expense. If they are going to go pick up supplies for a legal clinic or a housing clinic or something like that, that is an administrative expense. So program expenses, as a general rule with this grant, are always directly client facing. They serve one specific client household, and that's a good way to remember it. We have a question about whether or not computer equipment can be purchased through this grant for staff. This is a very complex question because it gets into a whole bunch of procurement standards and a bunch of different facets. But in general, yes, it is. You can find more details in our program guidelines, and I won't get into all of it. But if there's no individual purchases over $5,000, as well as the fact that you are paying for those computers from your admin budget, if they're intended for staff, that includes client-facing staff out of the admin budget. And then finally, that computer expense needs to be approved by TDHC HSS staff, usually through an approved budget that you have sent us. So those contract benchmarks that have gone out, if you put your computer expenses in there so we can formally approve those purchases. Okay, let's see what else. So questions about how to self-certify related to duplicated services and benefits. So this is a self-certification, and you can find a sample intake form on our website that has like a little blurb on what a self-certification for duplication of benefits might look like. There will also be additional information about that in your contracts when those are sent out. But in general, that is a self-certification. Yeah, encourage y'all to look at that form on our website. And if you need a link to our website, I did put it in the answer to that question in the chat box. So questions about expenses with pets. This is kind of an unfortunate answer because I love pets, I love animals. My dog is sleeping right next to me right now near the windowsill. But the only pet cost, unfortunately, that we have the green light to expend money on is going to be those pet deposits for apartment units. There's no other pet costs that we are able to incur through this grant, which includes like pet food, toys, health care, and that also includes temporary housing for pets. Unfortunately, it's just not something we have the green light to provide.
There's a few questions around gift cards. Maybe if we could go back to the gift card slide and go through that slide again, and then see if we can address any of the questions that have come through.
Sure.
So Frank, could you go through this gift card slide one more time, please?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll just go through it from the beginning to end. So gift cards are going to be an eligible program expense as long as they're used to purchase an eligible item under the ERA2 HSS program. So that includes food, basic clothing, and hygiene items for an eligible household, of course. As a subrecipient, you're required to keep receipts for the purchases and ensure that only eligible items have been purchased. However, if you're providing a gift card to, let's say, a restaurant or stores that only provide eligible items, so this would be a food co-op, a fast food restaurant, or a clothing resale store, you may be exempt from retaining specific receipts for the items purchased, provided that you note in your gift card policy how and why they vetted the establishment to ensure no ineligible items can be purchased. So, for example, as I said earlier, gift cards to restaurants that serve alcohol would not be eligible under a general gift card policy for receipts to not be tracked. However, if you provided a gift card to a restaurant that only served food, which is an eligible program expense, you would not necessarily have to collect the receipts and track them for the items purchased. But that would have to be outlined in your gift card policy and clearly detailed. So the easiest thing to do is to collect receipts for all items purchased with gift cards. Talking about, box stores, grocery stores, so those would require receipts to be tracked because we all know at HEB you can buy pretty much anything, and so ineligible items are sold there. So you'd have to track those receipts and make sure that only eligible items were purchased. Again, you have to document your gift card use in the client file, and you must have a written policy around gift card use. Don't think there are any questions about this part, but gift card fees do count as administrative expenses, while the actual gift card for allowable cost would be a program expense, and units of government are not allowed to purchase and distribute gift cards for clients. So I haven't actually seen these questions, but Kate, did that answer?
It did. There's a lot of questions around gift cards because we recognize it can be such a useful tool to assist a household who is facing housing instability. It seems like it could be just an easy thing to hand over, but we've seen this, and I know a lot of your organizations have probably seen this. It opens up an enormous area for fraud, and we do not want to get into that at all. So that's why these regulations are so strict in the 2 CFR 200 regulations, the federal regulations that we have to follow for this program and all federal programs that are administered by TDHCA. We recognize this, it can be a really useful tool. There are so many really specific questions around gift cards, but I do feel like we're trying as much as possible to answer these questions and provide as much flexibility without getting, without finding disallowed costs, right? We recognize that, a restaurant could be a great way for an unstably housed family or, household to receive a meal. But, if we limit it to restaurants that don't serve alcohol, that limits it to fast food, and those aren't healthy options. So if you, in your, developing your policy, come up with a really great option that you would want to share, please let us know so we can wrap that into our guidance and share that with the other subrecipients as well. So that's kind of a general statement. There was a question about, the big box stores again. Target, Walmart. We've had some organizations try to approach these stores to say, could you provide us just a gift card that can only be used for certain eligible items? We haven't had any success with that lately. If you have success, please share share how you do that. That would be really great for this network to have that route. Alex, is there anything more specific that you wanted to say? I know these are kind of general statements on gift card policies. I see Sharon has a good question about Amazon gift cards. I'm almost a little too afraid to dip into that because that could open up a lot of ineligible expenses. The question that she's asking is, can we do an Amazon gift card but buy the item right then and there for the client and you have the receipt? I mean, you could put that in a policy and see, just to very clearly make sure that that is not going to be in violation of the 2 CFR 200 rule. But if you're taking the time to purchase that anyway, you could also just make that a program expense and then provide it to the client, right? Alex, did you have something else that you wanted to say on gift cards? I'm not really monitoring these very detailed questions as they come in.
Just like two things, I think really quick to what Kate says is there's a few things that, from my understanding, our compliance staff and certainly federal auditors will scrutinize, and gift cards is one of those things. So when we tell you, if you want to do gift cards, you have to make sure you're tracking that, you know, the eligible expenses spent on that gift card with a receipt, and make sure you're only charging eligible expenses to this grant. That is something that is going to be scrutinized pretty closely. So that's why we're kind of a stickler for the rules here. And the second thing I want to say is that, you know, it's outlined more in our program guidelines, and I hope I get things very exact here. But food delivery expenses to households who are you know, at risk of homelessness, right? So if they're not able to receive these, you know, basic food items, basic hygiene supplies, you know, this is necessary for them to stay stably housed. You can pay for, you know, a reasonable food delivery cost. So if, you know, HEB food delivery cost or something like that, right, would be an eligible expense with program funds. Once again, the program guidelines are the best place to find this because it gets really specific, but also like it's an admin expense. However, if you were to have food delivered, for instance, to your headquarters, and then you were to deliver it to a client, right? So it's the difference, once again, of like, if the food is delivered directly to a client, eligible program expense. If it's delivered anywhere else and then given to a client, it would be an administrative expense. And you can find more details about that in our program guidelines. As far as the Amazon question goes, my inclination is to say, if it's an eligible expense, then yes, you can just purchase things on Amazon to be able to give to clients, or get delivered to clients. The question would be the shipping fees. I don't necessarily know the rules and regulations related to that, so I might need to follow up about that specifically. But my inclination right now is to say that might be allowable. But I can't give 100% yes, no.
Yeah, we'll follow up with that. And I think we'll need to clear that through our legal team for any guidance. There's a couple of more general topics that we're receiving a lot of questions on. The first is arrears, utility arrears and rental arrears. And then the next one is childcare. So let's kind of tackle each of those two topics. Let's go. Okay. So allowable expenses under the Housing Stability Program are for fees and deposits, not for arrears, right? You can't pay someone's back utility bills, someone's unpaid utility bills, but you can pay deposits for a connection or fee. The utility payments and arrears payments are an allowable expense under the Texas Rent Relief Program, which unfortunately is no longer accepting applications. So that, I think that kind of, that captures a few questions that had come in through the portal. Frank, do you think you could go through this slide again, please, just to give, I don't know, it helps me to hear it again as well.
Yeah, sure, of course. Okay, so again, these are direct household payments. talking about rental, utility deposits, and short-term payments for hotels or motels on this slide. So deposits that are provided to clients must not exceed more than 1 month's rent unless your organization submits a written request, including proof that it's customary in your local rental market to provide a double deposit. When your organization submits a written request, including this proof, we'll review it and we'll either approve or deny your organization's use of double rent deposits. Again, so utility reconnection fees are an eligible expense. Utility arrears are not an eligible expense. So any sort of payment for the use of utilities, whether in arrears or present day or in the future, would not be eligible. But any fees associated with using utilities would be eligible. Alex talked about pet deposits, so should not exceed $500 per pet or $1,000 for all pets. What were the specific questions, Kate, that we wanted to go over here?
Someone just said that they were confused about arrears, right? So, do we mean if the service has been off for several years? If someone has an outstanding balance, that's not something that we can pay, right? We can pay the fees associated or the deposits associated with getting a household connected with utilities.
Yeah, and that's something previously that the TRR program was providing, and I know there are some local rent relief programs that may still be providing this kind of services, but in our program it's not eligible.
Yeah, I will also add here, TDHCA has a utility assistance program. It's one of our regular ongoing programs. It's called the CAP, the, oh gosh, I know you guys know this, Comprehensive Energy Assistance Program. That's a program that we provide funding to community action agencies and other eligible entities. This program covers all 254 counties in the state. So if you're having trouble paying someone's utilities, if you have a client come in and you can provide them with housing stability services, but you're having trouble finding that utility payment, connect with the local CAP or Comprehensive Energy Assistance Program provider. And we'll provide a link to who all of those providers are, but connect to those other agencies in your area that have already received funds, and they've received additional funds. They've received a lot of COVID relief funds. Some of them have, a lot of funding, and especially going into these hot summer months, they can provide. And again, this is not housing stability. This is a separate program that you can connect with to layer these funds for your clients. If they can prove a certain eligibility for, if they need weatherization assistance, or if they need window units, or if they need fans. These are things that I think might be eligible under a separate program. So, it is hard for us to say, no, you can't do this, you can't do this. It's not allowed because Treasury says so, and these are our rules. But there are other programs out there funded by TDHCA that we would be happy to help connect you with if you're having those issues with utility payments. So I hope that's helpful. Alex, do you think that we have answered the questions on utilities? And maybe we could switch over to childcare. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention on utilities with the questions that have come in so far?
I think the only other question I've seen come in was specifically like, what is a utility reconnection fee? And to be honest, I didn't really know until we started this program and we started receiving questions about whether it would be an eligible expense. But generally, it's a fee levied specifically to reconnect utilities that have been shut off. So if there are a lot of utility arrears, and then let's say the client was able to get utility assistance to pay off that arrears, and the utility company were to say like, okay, but we can bring back on your power, but we're going to charge this fee to bring back on your power in addition. So we can't cover any of the arrears, but our funds can cover that fee, right? So, and once again, it's just a difference in how the programs are set up and designed.
Okay.
Child?
All right. Let's take a pause on the utility questions and shift to childcare. Is there a slide that we could bring up on childcare assistance? Here we go.
And I will say real quick, we will get to landlord incentives. So there's,
yeah.
I have our guidance pulled up. We're going to get into it. Don't worry.
Okay. So Frank, could you please go through this childcare expenses slide, and then we will try to address the specific questions that have come in on childcare expenses.
Yeah, of course. So under the ERA2 HSS program, childcare expenses would be an eligible program expense, of course, as long as they're in your budget and in your contract. So childcare expenses are going to be eligible if your client, of course, is eligible for assistance under the ERA2 HSS program, and they're searching for a new job in order to either maintain or obtain housing. And then if your client was to get a new job, then you could continue to provide childcare expenses 2 months beyond the start date of the job. And that's to ensure stability within the new role and, of course, linked to housing stability.
Thanks for that, Frank. We're just trying to coordinate through messaging real quick. Let me see.
Yeah, I'm looking over the questions right now as well.
Okay. Okay. And someone has asked about, documentation for childcare expenses. So if your organization is paying for someone's, childcare services while they're searching, it would just be, the documentation that you would get for any other service provided. It was the payment made from your agency, invoices and receipts from the childcare provider. And then again, if it's provided for this client, why is it being provided? They are searching for a job. You can document that they need it to maintain housing. And then, the invoices would match that additional 2 months beyond the start of a job. So, just think if an auditor was coming into your agency and asking to see, why you paid this expense, if you can backtrack it to meet the eligibility requirements that we've got here in this slide, and then additionally in the guidance, that would be our strong suggestion. Make sure you document as much as possible. But I think, outside of, the regular documentation from a childcare, an invoice, something like that, I can't think of anything else that you would need. Let me just skip.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Let's just say, just like any other program expense, there should be a paper trail. It should be kept in the client's file, and so that the expense can be detailed when there's a compliance inquiry. Yeah, and I don't know of any other specific documentation that would be required for childcare expenses.
Okay. Someone's asking, how can we document that someone is actually looking while they're, they're job searching while they're paying for these childcare expenses? That should be part of your, your case management notes. That should be, what you're doing, how you're working with this household to help them ultimately achieve housing stability. So, if they have meetings with the workforce board, if they're attending, employment services training, those types of documentation, it can be, notes that you've had a meeting with this household, documenting what their actual actions are. see. I think we might pause on these. There's a lot of really specific questions that are coming in. I want to make sure we get to everything within our allotted time. If there's nothing else jumping out, yeah, go ahead, Alex.
I just want to answer this question that just came in.
Oh, okay.
And it's about if a client has a part-time job, but can't maintain housing because they don't stay enough hours or don't have enough income. Once again, childcare, they have to be actively searching for a new job. So, you know, if they're not getting enough hours, but they want a job that gives them more hours or pays higher, or perhaps they're looking for even maybe a second job, which is the reality for many families, then you could pay for childcare. But if they're not actively searching for a job, it would not be an eligible expense.
Okay. All right. Should we switch
Should
over?
we do landlord incentives?
Take it away, Alex.
Can you bring us back to the slide, Meredith, please? Okay. So this is one of the ones where, once again, I'm going to encourage you to look at our program guidelines because there's a multiple paragraph explanation on landlord incentives. And I will inevitably miss something, which is how these things go. But I will actually read to you the definition from our program guidelines. So maybe I won't miss anything here. So what it says is landlord incentive payments and risk fees to improve the likelihood of finding housing through negotiating with landlords and expanding the housing pool for households facing barriers to housing. Examples, households with criminal backgrounds, poor credit, debt, or poor rental history. Subrecipients should keep a copy of the landlord incentive agreement and the lease, which should cover no less than 6 months. So the big distinction here between a landlord incentive and a risk fee generally is a landlord incentive is a negotiated fee between a subrecipient, so one of you all, and the landlord in order to get a household stably housed. If, in contrast, a risk fee is a general fee that a landlord will levy against any household that it deems a risk to lease to, right? So if it's just a fee that they flat add to any household that has inadequate rental history, that's a risk fee. But if one of your housing navigators or case managers has to go to a landlord and say, hey, we'll pay you up to 1 month's rent as per our landlord incentive policy to house this household, what do you think? That's a landlord incentive. So it's really the variability on it and whether or not it's negotiated. Landlord incentives do have to be based on a policy, like a written policy that does not encourage further barriers to housing for future clients. So what does that mean? You need to have certain limitations on how much you're willing to pay. So maybe it isn't a 1 month landlord incentive. Maybe you only do, half a month or something like that. Or maybe certain clients can get up to 1 month depending on what barriers they face and so forth. It should not be a case where there's kind of a free-form negotiation between the landlord and the subrecipient, where they're just like, oh, we want more money because we know you're willing to give it, right? There should be a written policy that clearly states how much you're willing to pay and the sort of stipulations for, why, like probably a stipulation related to evictions, right? Or if obviously the lease agreement has to be at least 6 months, right? So if a landlord chooses to evict a client before that 6-month period, do they have to repay the landlord incentive? That's usually a pretty good policy to have, barring some caveats, right? So landlord incentive payments and risk fees together cannot exceed 1 month's rent. This is a hard and fast rule. There's no getting around this. There's no way to make it greater than 1 month's rent. However, you can pay for a security deposit and a landlord incentive, right? So once again, a security deposit would go up to 1 month rent, and then you can pay another month's rent in a landlord incentive. If you're approved for 2 months rent security deposit, then you can pay a 2 months rent security deposit and then a 1 month landlord incentive. I think that brings me to the final thing, which is what is the difference between a security deposit and a landlord incentive? Once again, you can read our guidelines on both of these. Landlord incentives are non-refundable unless in certain cases as listed in your policy. Security deposits are refundable, right? So they go back to the tenant, and it's encouraged that security deposits go back to the tenant, and in certain cases go back to the subrecipient, right? In a case where the tenant is not able to receive that security deposit for any reason. We've gotten some questions about tax documentations related to landlord incentive payments. I'm going to follow up with our legal team on that because I am not a tax expert. So,
and I think any guidance we want to give on that would come in writing. I would hate for something to be misconstrued in this kind of a little bit more informal question and answer session. Before we jump away from this topic, could you please describe the approval and kind of the criteria we would look for the double deposit?
Yeah, so we keep this kind of free form because it's really going to depend on what kind of rental market you're in. My background is in geography, so and I studied the geography of housing markets. So the information that's going to be available to you to prove that the criteria, the Treasury criteria is that up to a 2 month security deposit is customary in the local rental market, right? Customary in the local rental market. So we do kind of leave it up to you to provide the best proof or evidence you can that it's customary. The first thing and best evidence you have is your own internal data about, we have, this many leases that we're working with and this many landlords have requested double security deposits. The second best thing is external data with partners. So if there's a local COC or something like that, or a larger network of housing nonprofits, homelessness prevention nonprofits, and they have data like, oh, this is usually what we pay in security deposits. It's generally over 1 month. This is customary. That's the second best data. We will accept data that does not explicitly prove that a 2 month security deposit is customary in the local rental market, if it strongly suggests the case for a double security deposit. So what is this kind of data? It's things like rental market studies, like good journalistic pieces about difficulties with higher security deposits and tight rental markets in your area. And with that sort of evidence, and also like you can use like ACS data to back that up, federal government sources. With that sort of evidence, we'd also want kind of a strong persuasive argument from your staff why that evidence points to the need for a double security deposit, right? We need something that we can show Treasury and say, here, this is why we approved the double security deposit. We think this is sufficient justification. So to recap, internal data, external partner data, and then if you don't have that, other external sources that strongly suggest the need for a double security deposit. I would generally say don't submit anything to us that is less than, a good argument is going to be probably 2 pages double spaced, unless you really have really good internal data. So that's what I will say.
Yeah, if the words reasonable and customary come directly from the Treasury guidance on this, on, if we were to approve. So show us that it is reasonable within your rental market. Show us that it is customary within your rental market. So that would be, customary would be something that, you've seen a trend over, months, years, right? Not something that just, last month we had this many clients and, we've had this many requests. We need a little bit more background data to then go ahead and approve providing double deposits. I know in some of the larger municipalities, it is just standard practice for a lot of housing assistance and homelessness assistance providers to provide this. So if you have questions, reach out to some of the other providers in your area and gather data from them, or gather information that they've seen within their clients. So reach out to your partners, please.
Yeah, honestly, a really good argument is just, hey, we know these 10 other organizations. It doesn't have to be that many. All of them are providing double security deposits. It's just standard practice. That's a really good argument. I want to return to one thing on landlord incentives, because there's a question asked about this. Security deposits, the amount of them have to be in the lease.
Mm-hmm.
Treasury says it has to be in the lease. Generally, the lease should say that, that security deposit is returned to either the client or the subrecipient, right? So it has to say it's refundable. Landlord incentives do not have to be in the lease, but you should have a written agreement with that landlord signed off by both parties that follows your landlord incentive policy. So once again, it's the kind of thing where if a compliance monitor or an auditor were to just see, checks going out to landlords without any sort of written agreement, that's going to, raise red flags. So it doesn't need to be in a lease, but needs to be in a written agreement. That's what I have for landlord incentives and security deposits.
Okay. I did see way back we had some questions about computers and computer purchases. So let's see, was there an equipment or computer purchase slide that we could bring up and go over that slide, please? Okay.
Where would that be?
Slide 13.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, Frank, could you just repeat the computer section in here, or the equipment section for this slide?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So eligible program expenses would include the purchase of a computer or broadband assistance, which is going to directly help a client attend an HSS training program to search for employment or to communicate with a remote medical provider. Any purchases of computers, broadband internet, or phone services for general program use is not an allowable program cost. That may be allowable as an administrative cost if it applies directly to the ERA2 HSS program. No individual purchase of equipment, $5,000 or more is allowed. And computer purchases for staff would be considered an administrative expense. So this goes back, to the question, does this activity directly help a household obtain or maintain housing. If the purchase of a computer or equipment is not for a client and isn't it is for general program administration, then it would be an administrative cost. And that's even for a staff who's maybe a housing navigator. So through the program you'd purchase a computer for them so they can help clients. That would still be considered an administrative cost.
Okay. Okay, and if you do have specific questions about equipment purchases, computer purchases, as we're finalizing benchmarks and budgets, let's talk specifically about what you specifically want to put in your budget, what you want to get approved, if you need computers for your staff or whatever it is. Let's make sure we get those questions answered directly, and then they go in your contract and in your budget. So you've got that written approval from us directly. We did have, I think I'll shift away from this, but go ahead and leave up this slide as general allowable and not allowable expenses. There was a question about someone didn't see, basic hygiene items and cleaning supplies. Not all of the eligible expenses are included in the slides. Please refer back to the program guidelines, and we have just posted updated guidelines. So, read through that, take a while to digest it, and then come back and ask us questions. I will say that in the guidance, for these hygiene items, let me just pull up and I'll just read it directly. Let's see. So basic hygiene items that you can provide. These are consumable hygienic items, wet wipes, laundry detergent, dryer sheets, hand sanitizer, feminine products, soap and shampoo, things like that. Also basic cleaning supplies, they would be allowable. Additionally, beyond that, the basic amount of hygiene supplies, trash can, laundry basket, broom, dustpan, and mop. Beyond that, that gets into furnishings. Furnishings are not allowable under this grant. We've requested that Treasury make it an allowable expense, but we have not received that. So anything beyond those basic, small, mostly consumable hygienic items, those are allowable, but anything beyond that could fall into a furnishings category is not allowable. And again, please, read specifically in the guidelines. The slides that we've provided here are just kind of examples of what would be and would not be allowable. I haven't looked at the questions portal, but I hope that didn't just open up a whole bunch of more questions. Let's see. Okay. Moving fees. This is something that we haven't touched on as much yet. I don't know if we had a slide for moving fees. Again, in the guidance, Alex, I'm going to put you on the spot. Could you talk about moving fees, please?
Sure. So the key thing with moving fees is that you do need to obtain 3 quotes for these moving expenses. This includes both the rental of a moving van or the hiring of movers. So both those things would require 3 quotes. I don't know what else to say about moving fees. They're kind of a weird one because moving expenses are very subject to, the reason why you're required to have 3 quotes is we need to ensure that cost is reasonable, right? We need to, as federal guidelines says, that cost is reasonable and necessary to ensure that household can obtain or maintain housing, right? So You should obtain 3 quotes and generally choose the cheapest of those quotes that fulfills the purposes of moving, right? There's no hard and fast rules on what moving expenses look like, because existing subrecipients have used this provision and this eligible service in a lot of unique ways. So it could be, moving a household that is in, temporary housing or a hotel to a, more permanent living situation. We have gotten it okayed by our legal team that, you are able to load up a moving truck at a local donation drop-off and bring donated furniture to a household as part of moving into a new unit, right? It has to be a moving fee, right? So it can't be, they've been living in this unit for a while and now we're going to bring them furniture. It has to be a moving expense. And that would be okay. We don't have the okay from Treasury yet to pay for furniture, but the actual moving of the furniture you can pay for. We have subrecipients who use, moving expenses to help, someone experiencing homelessness or who is at risk of homelessness move in with a family member. So those sorts of things, all the different ways moving fees are used, but you do need to have 3 quotes. You need to be able to sufficiently prove that those moving fees are reasonable and necessary to help the household obtain or maintain housing. So,
okay. I think at this point, we've received a lot of general questions. We've tried to answer them as much as possible that would benefit the group. We do have a lot of very specific questions, so we will follow up directly with you. Could you please advance to the final slide? Someone asked, after the webinar, where can we ask additional questions? In the development of your final benchmarks and budget that are going to go into your contract, that will define, what you're going to provide as housing stability services going forward. Members of our staff will be in contact with you to directly answer these questions, to get everything documented and finalized in your contract so they're ready for signature. It will be at least 1 or 2 of the staff that are, our contact information is up on this screen. If you feel like a question is not being answered, or maybe it's gotten lost in a group of questions, you can always reach out to hss@tbhca.state.tx.us. That's just the main HSS Housing Stability Services email that we all have access to and check. Someone is designated every day to make sure questions get answered from there. So, if someone is out or if you're unable to get questions asked, just, send them to that main HSS webpage, or I'm sorry, email. But we will be in direct contact with you as we, hone all of the, from what you had applied for, what you had been awarded funding for, with the budget reduction for everyone, what now fits and what's allowable, what's the best to serve your eligible population in your area. So we will be in contact with you. Please reach out to us with questions. We'll try to either post, all of these questions online, or, wrap them into an updated version of the guidelines. I want to try to eliminate sending you guys to 9 different places to find guidance. So, maybe it's a short term, we'll get the questions posted, and then long term, this will be wrapped into another updated version of our guidance that will continually add to things that were, questions that are being asked of us, that we've gotten cleared through legal and then can now be shared with the group. So I really hope that this was helpful. I know today's kind of the most scattered day because there's so many things that you could do with housing stability. And I know because we're getting so many questions, I know that you're really trying to set this up correctly from the beginning. Do this, expend these funds in the best way possible to have the most impact on eligible households. So I thank you for this. I thank you for all of the questions that you've submitted. Thank you, Frank, for leading us through the slides today. So I think, please send your questions. If we're going to end the webinar in just a moment, if you think of something, send it to us, but know that we will be in contact with you. So I think with that, have a wonderful day. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, and Alex will be going through all of the reporting requirements. That's it. Have a wonderful day, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.